Have you heard? McDonald's, the burger OG, took their classic burgers back to the kitchen and they've come out hotter, juicier, and tastier. Onions added at the grill, perfectly melted cheese. Plus, the burger icon, the Big Mac, now has more Mac sauce. Just how good are these burgers?
Rubble.
Yep, they're so good they got the Hamburglar's attention. Better get down there before he eats them all. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba. Available at most restaurants in this area.
Sometimes it takes a different approach to help you unlock your true potential. With Capella University's game-changing FlexPath learning format, you gain relevant skills you can apply to your career right away. Earn your degree from an accredited university and be confident in the quality of your education. Imagine your future differently at capella.edu. Capella University is accredited by the Higher Learning Commission. Learn more at capella.edu/accreditation.
Welcome to the Media Roundtable Special Edition, where we dive deep into the secrets of the craft of audio and provide perspectives on the industry in service of the Chief Audio Officer. That is the person who is responsible for the success of an audio marketing program. It's a narrow lane, but very important. And the beauty of podcast is you can talk about highly specialized topics such as this. I'm your host, Dan Granger, CEO and founder of Oxford Road. And today we're going to be looking back at 2023 and talking about what are the most meaningful stories that happened in the business of podcast and audio this year. We're going to talk about some of our other friends like streaming and radio as well. And we're going to talk about what does it mean for the industry as we look to 2024, which is promising to be at least as interesting as 2023. So today I'm very excited because I am joined by a friend who's been a friend of the audio industry for many years. His name is Steve Goldstein, and you may have seen him speaking as a keynote at Podcast Movement or various other conferences. He is clearly a thought leader in the space. Steve is the founder and CEO of Amplifi Media, where they support and consult different entities, whether it's podcasting, radio, satellite, voice, in scaling audio ventures. And he's developed some really amazing initiatives that you've heard about, including the leading branded podcast in the industry, probably the poster child that everybody uses. That is co-produced by Amplifi. And in addition to that, Steve teaches the class on the business of podcasting, really the only one at a major university. He teaches the business of podcasting at NYU and was kind enough to have me as a guest speaker to one of his classes within the last few months. And it's amazing because he's bringing the wisdom of what's been going on in audio and trying to translate it into the understanding of a very different culture and climate and way of thinking about media with young people today than I think what most of us are able to really experience on the front line. So it's going to be a fascinating conversation. I'm glad he was able to make this time for us today to look back at 2023 and talk about what are the big stories and how do we adapt to them going forward as we look at 2024. So welcome, Steve. Thanks for being on the Media Roundtable podcast.
So happy to be here, but the pressure is clearly on as a solo guest, but I'm ready. I think I'm ready.
Well, and that's why I said when we were just prepping for this that Haley, who is one of the producers of the Media Roundtable, is just going to message us during the conversation if she starts to get bored or feels that we're going too deep into the depths of the intricacies of audio.
We call that engagement, Dan.
We call that engagement.
The engagement factor remains high enough.
We'll see how it goes. So I'm going to throw out a series of topics that I know you have thought about, written about, spoken about, and just get your point of view about what happened in 2023 that was significant for those of us that work in the business. And the first one I want to bring up is, it's one of these questions that has vexed us since I started dealing with this, almost 2 decades ago, and I'm sure you too. And that is, what is a podcast? And the relationship between the way we define what a podcast actually is, which has massive implications, and things like, does it have to have an RSS feed? Is it a podcast if it's video? What is it? And how has that evolved this year?
Yeah, so, when I'm putting together my stuff for the NYU students, it gives me a real opportunity to think through a different lens. In other words, everybody in that room was born post 2000, and their experiences with audio are very different than yours or mine. And so I divided it up into 3 eras podcasting. The first one I would call the MeUndies era. And that was when we first started listening to podcasts, and you get the codes, and there's a lot of public radio podcasts. There wasn't a lot of technology. This is before you were in the business, I'm sure, because there was no technology involved in any of those discussions.
I'm going to stop you. You should know, and I'm glad we get to set the record straight here today. We introduced MeUndies to the audio channel. And actually, they were one of our first clients at Oxford Road at the very, very beginning. There was this wave of D2C brands, Hulu, Blue Apron, Dollar Shave Club, MeUndies, that were the people we were working with at the very beginning that really helped define that era. And so I'm glad to hear you call them out. I just want to make sure that we get our credit for that part of the story.
You deserve all of that credit. Totally foundational. And why I picked MeUndies, because it's humorous. The whole era was really critical in the development. And you got to give public radio the credit that it deserves, because they were really the first ones in. Commercial endeavors really way behind. So the second era would be the throwing spaghetti against the wall era. And that is when companies came in and sort of figured out, hey, there could be a business here. And they spun up studios and staffs and hired all sorts of people for titles that didn't exist before. And the focus was garnering market share. So they would try stuff. And this happens, I think, in every business as it starts on its growth phase. And that's what happened here. A lot of experiments. A lot of them didn't end particularly well, but a lot of experiments that needed to happen. And then we move to your question, which is, what's a podcast? Because I think that's where we are at this moment. This takes us up to today. Does it have to have that RSS feed, or is it likely to be something else? And I think about this, and we'll talk about this probably quite a bit. I think about this outside of podcast terms. I think about things like NBC. They used to feed shows to affiliates around the country. That's not the business they're in anymore. And weirdly, they used to pay the affiliates. Now the affiliates pay them, but their content is on apps and streams, and it's all over the place. They're going to do whatever it takes, including YouTube, to get audience. And that's where we are in podcasting. Are we so tethered to the RSS feed that we're stuck? Or can we use some mental gymnastics and think about things beyond that, like YouTube, like TikTok, whatever else happens? Can we be more pliable? And so I would like to think that we can move past the RSS feed and be more nimble and focus on garnering audience wherever it comes from.
Do you think there's a scenario where the big players that you're talking about, YouTube and TikTok leading those examples, move toward the RSS and integrate it instead of us redefining on the user side where we draw our lines?
Yeah, we're seeing that to a certain degree with YouTube. I think they're trying to be more amenable to the industry. It is not the model that they've used anywhere. If that can be successful, bravo. But I think we, as people in the podcast space, need to be, what do I want to say? We need to be more flexible.
Well, and as you think about the reason that it's even a discussion, can you just break down for some of the audience why an RSS feed is a material factor and how we even decide where to draw our lines?
Sure. Well, RSS stands for Real Simple Syndication, and that's primarily what it is. It's very flexible. It is not dynamic. It doesn't come with a lot of data. A lot of advertisers, as you know far better than I, are used to dealing with rich data environments, and podcasting has some of that, but it doesn't natively have all of that. But that is what this industry has been built on, and yet, I don't know why it can't or shouldn't evolve.
And when you think about the ways forward for audio, and it sounds like what you're really saying is we need to move into an environment where we can look at the source of spoken word content and be less concerned about defining it based on distribution platform, but just saying wherever people will consume it, that's where it needs to go. You wrote a very interesting article about this recently, which I'm going to want to get into. But I wonder, especially when we're talking about YouTube and TikTok, is the visual component not something we still need to wrestle with? Does it deserve the term podcast when the majority of the audience is actually taking it in visually?
So we did a study in August with Coleman Insights. It was a pretty breakthrough piece of research about YouTube and podcasts. And it was the first study that I was involved in, but the first study we had seen that went from soup to nuts on how people are using the platforms. And I think the first thing that we learned, which is really instructive and important, is that podcast apps are not binary. People are using more than one app. 72% of people reported more than one app. That's a wow. So there are different use cases for different platforms. And so sometimes people will watch the video of a podcast. Other times, maybe they'll just take a quick look to see what the guest looks like, or other times they'll just listen to audio. They're still pretty flexible with all of that. I don't think there is an expectation that every podcast has to have a video component, but you have to think about that in terms of compatibility with YouTube and how much the algorithm favors video. And I don't really have the answer to that. We would have to talk directly to the YouTube folks. But I think we know that there is a bias toward video, whether that's full-on video or whether that's some other incremental step, I think needs to be determined over time. But it doesn't automatically mean that people are watching the podcast. It means that many of them think about watching the podcast or occasionally watch the podcast.
So it's interesting when I think about myself as a consumer, I think about there are podcasts which are distributed through YouTube. And I'll typically, if I know that it started with podcast, I usually use one of the podcast players first. But there are TV shows that are distributed as podcasts where a lot of times I'm not going to be sitting in front of a screen and able to take that in. So I will then listen to the podcast version of that TV show. So I feel like it goes both ways. But, to bring it back to the central question, which is, when is it a podcast and when is it not? And where do you think that should go?
And I don't care. I gotta say, I don't care. My background is content and audience, and sales dollars chase ears. So let's go find ears wherever they are. We'll figure the mechanics out.
Well, and I think, okay, so from our lens, because we're dealing with the advertising side so much, the reason I think that this is probably more important than it may feel to most folks is that the attention it gets from an advertiser can very much get defined by the labeling. So a brand may want to support podcasts and they may have a budget for podcasts, but then we'll often get into conversations where they have an influencer group that they work with, or they have an in-house team that sources influencer shows, which are video native. And even though they are, we can call them podcasts and say, well, they all have ears. There may or may not be attention paid to certain shows if they appear to be something that doesn't fit with the handle of podcast, which people generally associate with audio. And so I think there may be more urgency for the practitioners to actually have a common definition that may have a little more elasticity than the one that we've had. The one I would advocate for personally is that it's a podcast if I can shut off my video and I still want to keep consuming it. To me, that should be good enough. If it's something other than that, we can call it influencer, we can call it television, we can call it video streaming, whatever you want. But if I need the visual, then I think it's something differently. Whereas I think if we're going to use the term podcast, it should have some connective tissue to where it started, which is audio native content. It's about voice and conversation first over what I would consume with my eyes. That's just me. I don't even know that that's the best answer. It's just the best I've been able to come up with. Would you have any adaptation of that, or how do you feel about that potential definition?
I totally agree with that. I mean, the DNA of what people are creating is audio first. The augmentation is the video to adapt to other platforms. And again, I don't know that the Daily from the New York Times is ever going to do a video component, and yet there it is sitting at the top of the charts. So the utility drives so much of this. And what do they do on YouTube? There's a logo sitting there. There's a video logo. And will they ever be a monster on YouTube? I have no idea. But they are smart enough to be on YouTube because there is incremental audience gain that's occurring there. And who knows where that will occur in the future. But you could be pretty well assured that what we've learned in the past couple of years is this is evolving rapidly.
Well, and I think because there are, to actually execute this stuff, there are roles and responsibilities that are divvied up that impact dollars based on these definitions. And I think it would probably behoove us as an industry to get a few groups together and just align on what do we mean when we say the word podcast, so that the buying community, we have a common language and it isn't so subjective. Because right now I see people defining it in contradictory ways, left and right. And who's to say one is right and one is wrong? So it's a little chaotic, as you may have heard.
Yeah, and that's plumbing, and that is not derogatory in any sense. I think every industry is going through that. What happens if it's going through CTV or a Roku box? I mean, all of these things get figured out, but the audience is always right. They just are.
Yes, they are.
And again, watching my NYU students, which is particularly instructive, they're not thinking about whether they're going to watch it or listen to it. They're not thinking about which app they're going to use. They're wherever they are, and they expect that content to be available there. And if it's not, they move on. And one of the things we saw in the YouTube study was that 25% of a person's favorite podcasts were not on YouTube. That doesn't make sense. You got to be there.
So while we're on this line of conversation, let's talk about your post on the multi-platform imperative and what you've been learning from these folks. Can you talk a little bit about that? And I'm going to prompt you with a question that came up as we've been discussing this, which is, who's Elvis Duran, and why that's an important question, right?
Right. Yes. And Elvis is somebody I know and like, but he is not in the circuit, not with these students in New York, by the way. And students in New York are probably different than students in Columbus, Ohio, or Indianapolis, or whatever. They're not driving cars, and so their audio habits may be different. Nonetheless, I have 3 science projects. I have a 33-year-old, I have a 31-year-old, and I have a 25-year-old. And they may be aware of Elvis Duran, but that doesn't mean they're listening to Elvis Duran or choosing to listen to Elvis Duran. And I think the point there is that there's a lot of audio out there. The question is, how do we marry that up with particular segments and particular groups? In this case, this younger group, and they're all, in their early 20s, they are seeking and finding audio in ways that it's somewhat intuitive and yet eye-opening. I mean, I'm learning from them, hopefully not as much as they're learning from me, but I'm certainly learning from them that that there's an elasticity. They can move from platform to platform pretty rapidly. And their expectation is that they can find the content. And sometimes the content is in a different form. So on TikTok, they're watching segments of shows and they'll go find the next segment of the show. This seems counterintuitive to me in terms of flow from a show, but it's happening. The numbers are huge, but it is how they're finding and discovering some video content, not podcast content, video content.
Well, and I want to move toward the subject of radio, which is near and dear to our hearts. But I think before we do, I just want to acknowledge that in the marketplace, the people that are making the purchasing decisions, the chief audio officers, a lot of times where a brand shows up and the types of audio native content or conversations that they support will very much be impacted by the awareness of that marketplace by the marketer. So if they're early out of school, they're going to be attracted to podcast and YouTube influencers, and radio may or may not make a lot of sense for their business. But if they're not familiar with it, I can talk to my 18-year-old daughter about all the radio personalities, and the only reason she might recognize some of them is because she's been living with me her whole life, right? But otherwise, she'd have no exposure to these people. Whereas I can talk to somebody over 40 about the nationally syndicated radio personalities that shaped the last few decades and their household names versus unrecognizable to somebody that's, 15 years younger. So it's important from a buying standpoint. I think that if I'm listening to this conversation and I'm a marketer, I think it's important that you know what you don't know and become more familiar, depending on what type of audience you need to reach to grow your business, that you're familiarizing yourself with the audiences, the personalities who may be very interesting to those audiences, rather than just limiting it to the ones that you happen to have personal exposure to based on your consumption habits.
Totally agree with that. And then there are, I promise not to stay on the NYU thing too long, but for example, Emma Chamberlain's podcast is huge. Why? Because she's providing useful information to them, and they can't necessarily find that anywhere else. That's a blind spot of other media.
Indeed it is. And I think, like you said, the market's going to decide and the market's going to sort this out, but we're going to continue to see casualties and diminishing market share from existing players if they don't figure out a way to bridge the gap between the influencers of old and the influencers that are the new generation. So it's a challenge. Well, and with that, so there's a lot of research that's come out this year suggesting that our consumption habits are changing and that we have actually crossed the line to more audio being consumed on digital platforms than AM, FM. What does that mean as you look at the landscape and having your perspective, as I have, of only being here based on growing out of the radio industry, right? What does this mean to you?
So a couple of things. So it's an Edison research data point, and Larry Rosen and I were talking about this and how seismic it is to see one coming down and the other coming up. And just right now, they're starting to cross. So demographically, it's going to be different. If you look at that by younger demos, it crossed a while ago. But I think when we think about the category of spoken word audio, which is where podcasting lives, most of that content is now being consumed on a mobile device. It indexed much higher than the overall listening chart that I think you're referring to. So I believe that ship has sailed. It is much more of a digital environment for for audio consumption than it is, towers out in the field. Some of that, of course, has to do with the car, has to do with the frictionless notion of being able to punch up a radio. That is improving for the digital audience, but demographically, it's more challenging for the upper demos.
All right, so tell me if you've ever heard of any of these companies. Indeed, Shopify, NetSuite, Headspace, Quip, Theragun, Postmates. You know, I'm not only the host of the Media Roundtable, but also CEO of a company called Oxford Road, and we are the world's leading independently owned and operated audio ad agency. And what that means is that we help great companies, many that you have probably heard of on some of the other podcasts that you listen to. We help them test and scale campaigns in audio channels, with podcast being one of those leading channels. Some of the work that we do includes media planning and buying, as well as analytics, attribution, and insights. And we also have a very special way that we deal with creative and copy generation. We have our own proprietary process called Audiolytics that allows us to score ads for their persuasiveness. If you're looking to be involved in audio and you want a partner that can help work with you to make sure that you achieve unprecedented ROI and massive scale, you should get in touch with us at Oxford Road. And by the way, the only reason that we're able to do the work of the Media Roundtable is because we have a great team at Oxford Road that supports us and makes it possible. So, you know, what we're doing is not just a podcast, but we're really trying to help brands live out their values and balance that with their business objectives, which is an increasingly hard thing to do in this world of misinformation and malice that's infecting so much of our media. But at Oxford Road, we don't want to just broker this stuff. We want to impact the industry for good. We want to raise the bar on what gets created. And Oxford Road is helping make that possible through the Media Roundtable. So if you're somebody that's interested in working with an ad agency or a partner on this type of work for your advertising campaigns, go to oxfordroad.com. It's easy to spell. And get in touch with us, or at least just sign up for our free newsletter, The Influencer. That's oxfordroad.com. So what does it mean for the broadcasters who still own the tall towers and big fields? And how do they survive? And then I'm interested in, as a marketer, is it even worth continuing to pay attention to AM, FM radio as a distribution channel for your ads, or should you just move on to where the audience is going?
Yeah, and you also have to look at how slow the progress has been for AM, FM to migrate to digital. And some of that, I think, has to do with the finances and trying to stay afloat. Some of it has to do with cultural stuff. Some of it has to do with 22 minutes of commercials in an hour. I mean, there's a lot of factors. We work with a big broadcast company on their digital transformation. And it's interesting listening to one of the senior execs say, hey, we're holding up pretty well. They seem to like the broadcast coming through the tower, the transmitter, better than most industries. And I would argue it's probably the opposite. I think the fact that the car is still ubiquitous and easy has slowed the progress of digital consumption. But again, if you look at by demo, you can clearly see that it's jumped the shark. And, you know, CarPlay and Google Audio and whatever it is becoming more essential in the customer purchase priorities. You know, I believe that's now ahead of cup holders. So you know you've made it. So I do think that radio has opportunity there because it is cume. Radio has a lot of audience. It's a question of what they want to do with that audience. And they should be introducing them to more digital audio, because no one can find that show that they were running at 2 p.m. on Saturday, but they can find it digitally and use it that way. They've been afraid of it. I think they're becoming less afraid of it. I think the numbers are a little difficult for broadcasters to decode because they think in terms of audience share, but they need to look underneath and see the PUM levels and the things that are changing. And they've changed significantly from pre to post pandemic.
Well, and look, I don't know if you carry this, but I carry some feeling of, I don't want to say loyalty, because I think we err on the side of our fiduciary duty to what the advertisers need first. But I do feel I want radio groups to adapt, and I want them to succeed. I don't want them to fail, right? And I think the challenge is, I know from having worked inside that ecosystem, when you talk about 22 minutes of commercial time per hour that goes on a radio station, and you look at the fact that they still have to answer to the FCC, they are fighting this battle with their arms tied behind their backs. So what do they need to do broadly as an industry? And what should marketers be doing when they think about what is still happening in AM/FM radio and whether or not to take the time to engage with it?
So we did a study with the RAB about a year and a half ago, focused on podcasts. And it was about what broadcasters are doing in podcasts, not what consumers are doing with podcasts, but what broadcasters are doing. And so it's a year and a half old, but I would say it's by and large the same. A couple of radio groups have jumped in big time and are doing a really good job, or certainly making headway. But I think the biggest impediment for radio in general is that they want this to be profitable on Tuesday. And it's not going to be profitable on Tuesday.
No,
it's going to take a couple of years to develop. And so do they have the patience, and do they have the R&D department? They pretty much don't, but they need to. They need to develop other forms of contact with audience that go beyond where they were in 1981.
And what would that look like?
So that gets us all the way back to the thing we were talking about earlier, multi-platform.
Multi-platform. Simple as that.
It's as well, yeah, it's simple to say, hard to do, but yes, I think it's incumbent upon every broadcaster to be multi-platform. And I'll go back to TV again. This is what linear local TV has learned. And if they didn't have retrans, the fees that they get for retransmission on cable, they'd be totally sunk right now. But they have learned that audience for the 11 o'clock news isn't there anymore. But they have mobile apps, and mobile apps are big business for them. And they are learning how to adapt with all of the other streaming platforms. You now see the local TVs up on Peacock because NBC owns that. I mean, they're just trying to figure out other ways to distribute their content. They have a vital newsroom. Who has a vital newsroom anymore? The newspapers don't have a vital newsroom.
KFI AM 640.
Okay, and they are the exception. And 1010 wins in New York. You know, but there are just a handful of those.
It's hard.
And so they need to start thinking about multi-platform in a very aggressive way.
Well, and what about the advertisers? If I'm a millennial media, or I'm a marketer, I'm a head of growth or a head of brand or a CMO, how do I need to be thinking about terrestrial radio? Or do I just move on with my life?
So one of the things that we do with the digital transformation with the company that we're working with, we talk about any audience anywhere. The advertiser is not necessarily interested in radio commercials. They're interested in an audience. And the better that a radio operation becomes at understanding that and selling that, the more significant their billing will be. There are, I can tell you there's an advertiser in that company. It's a large casino, and they are marginally interested in the radio commercials, but they're very interested in the tools that the radio company has to market beyond broadcast. And so they are feeding a lot of money through that radio company, but their care level in the radio commercials may not be what the radio company wants it to be, but the radio company understands that they can be the digital agency on a local level.
And I would add to that, I think, I've asked you the question. Now I'm going to answer the question that I asked, which is I think that marketers need to continue to look at it, partly because of the reach and where it's going. I agree with everything that you said, but I would also argue that if I'm talking to a brand, their loss, and by they I mean the broadcasters, is your gain, in that the premium that you're going to pay for that impression is gone. It is a buyer's market of buyer's markets, and you can do things with radio that were not possible from a value standpoint before, because that it's going to be discounted because of the kind of existential threats that it's facing. But that's not your problem today. And so there's value to be had in engaging and leaning in. And I still believe that even with the saturation loads and the challenges, pound for pound, audio impressions outperform the general index of what you can purchase. So if you can buy them wisely and buy them for a good value, it is worth the time. That's my general position on the matter. All right. I know we're running out of time here, and there's still a few important topics I want to touch. I think this year, without question, and you've weighed in on this already, is what's happening to the podcast industry. I think the New York Times had a headline that summed a lot of the other stories up this year when it said podcast companies once walking on air feel the strain of gravity, and that the dumb money era is over.
Mm-hmm.
Is podcast, did we as an industry become victims of our own hype, and is the future as bright as we once thought it was? Or is this a temporary setback? What do you make of all of the bad news that came out for the podcast industry this year?
Boy, and that is such a good summary. It's been all bad news. It's cuts in advertising rates. It's cuts in podcast production. How many new podcasts there are? Yeah, I think all of that is true, and all of it sort of mirrors every other industry. I mean, there were 186,000 job cuts in the tech business in 2023, but I doubt the tech business is over. And I think back to the dot-com bubble, or the metaverse, which I think has been replaced by AI already. So, yep. But I don't think this is unusual that businesses grow rapidly and then they end up needing to right size. And that's the term you see even with Spotify, which just today, the day we're recording this, just dropped another 17% of the staff. But the right sizing is about making money. And so I think a lot of these companies that built capacity and did not see the return on that capacity rapidly decided, okay, maybe we ought to pull back on this. Maybe we don't understand this as well as we thought. But then I go back to our conversation from just a couple of minutes ago about spoken word growing so rapidly, and I say, focus on that. That's where the win is. There's plenty of people who are going to listen to this content, but they're not going to listen to mediocre content. So I think it comes down to high value content, HVC, something that I like to talk about a lot. And I think you and I touched on my grid of pain, which goes all the way back to my radio days, where you need to be in the upper right-hand corner, which is high familiarity and high value content, versus where most podcast content lives, which is in the lower left quadrant, which is low value and low awareness. And that's true in all entertainment. So I think podcasting is sort of at that moment where it's realizing maybe we shouldn't put out 20 shows. Maybe we should put out 4 really good shows.
4 good ones, yeah. And so if I'm a marketer, if I'm at a brand and I'm in the process right now of finalizing what my budget allocation is going to be between channels, should I not take where I was with podcast a year ago and write that down a little bit? Or is this a time to be increasing my investment?
Well, you would know better than I, but my vote would be there's fantastic content out there right now that is underutilized in terms of advertisers. I would be jumping in on this durable, great content. I would taking some shots on niche podcasts that cover categories really well. You know, it's cliche, but there are riches in niches, and I think finding those niches that takes some extra effort. It's harder than buying the top 25 podcasts, but there's a lot of great content that comes out that is under monetized.
Fully agree with you. And in the same way that radio has gone from a market to a severe buyer's market, which is big opportunity for advertisers, I think podcast has returned to being more of a buyer's market because I do believe it has felt the strain of gravity. And I think that where the dumb money era is over for the publishers and the networks and the creators, where, hey, let's just keep making more and they're going to buy them forever and we're always going to move up and to the right. I think advertisers, some have had to feel the same thing. There were a lot of brands taking a lot of flyers on shows that made a lot of big promises that they weren't able to deliver. And the brands, I think, got stuck at the caboose of the train that was chasing these big talent deals, all the minimum guarantees. Well, those costs were trying to get passed over to the advertisers. And frankly, it stopped being as good a business when you bought those marquee assets. Meanwhile, you've got a long tail of shows that have always been undervalued and undermonetized. And I think what we've seen this year is advertisers being a little more receptive to diversification and being willing to figure out how to utilize that longer tail. So you're not just chasing the top 25 on reach and not just placing big bets because a new celebrity decided they're going to talk into a computer. And so therefore we're going to, bet the farm on those strategies for fear that our competitors will get it. Like that's kind of ending. But I think that it's becoming a more responsible ecosystem. And, whether or not you should be increasing or decreasing your investment, I think depends on what you've been doing so far. Most people still have a lot of headroom in this channel, but it's not because you weren't paying the premiums because they told you that somebody else was going to buy it if you didn't sign it by Tuesday. That kind of business, I think, is drying up, and it should.
Well, and again, that mirrors a lot of other industries. I mean, look, this is the entertainment business, and a lot of good ideas don't come out, which is why in TV, for example, they have make goods. They've always had make goods. They introduced a fall lineup, and most of those shows, end up after 6 or 7 episodes gone. Here, I think some of these siloed efforts, some of these exclusives that were launched by various companies, that was painful. You're just not going to see that much of it going forward. Economically, it doesn't make sense.
Well, and as somebody that knows branded content and has had success in branded content, I believe that branded content broadly has been overpriced and overpromised on what it can deliver. And I'll leave it to you to share your insight on when to versus not to invest in branded content, because I think that's been a real point of confusion.
Yeah, so branded content is, I've written about this a few times. Branded content, it suggests that people are interested in long-form content from a particular brand. I don't really need a relationship with Crest beyond I go into the store, I go into CVS, I have to figure out which of the 26 different varieties I need to be purchasing, and I purchase it. I don't need a podcast on toothpaste. A lot of brands aspire to have a relationship with their customers, and they may or may not. I mean, we're fortunate. We do some work for some clients who do have relationships. We've worked in the past for Ernst & Young. They have a great relationship. They also need to be an authority on certain economic issues, so that makes sense to me. We work for a client in Des Moines, Iowa, NCMIC. They're the largest insurance provider to chiropractors. They have about 45,000 clients. They talk to their 45,000 clients. That's the podcast. It's another means of contact rather than just a newsletter or an email newsletter. It's a contact point. That's good use of branded content.
Yes. And the I think maybe one opinion I have that I'd love you to respond to is, I think that audio is a great channel for a niche audience if you're not if you don't need to make it a profit center for the business. And I think the Colgate's biggest problem, if we're just going to pick on Colgate as a theoretical, is that, you know, when a brand comes in and says, we need to have a branded podcast, they think that it's going to be the Joe Rogan experience. And the truth is, that's a bit of an overreach. Now, does that mean that you shouldn't, like, there's no avenue to super serve a constituency within your community that you want to use audio as a tool to reach? Sure. But I think that what most people don't realize yet is that a few million of the podcasts in the library today are simply newsletters that should be looked at the same way as their email newsletter or the blog for that company or their social media feed. Create it, put it out there. Don't expect that the world's going to line up and be entertained by it. But if you have a focus and you can use that as an extension without the burden of saying, we're going to put millions into this thing, and that you're going to have to show a tangible ROI in the short term because it has to be a successful show on its own right, on its own merits, that's where I think things get too blurry too fast. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, totally agree with that. And then there is the passion part of it. Certain brands, John Deere would be a passion brand. They have a lot of things that they can teach their constituency. REI, an outdoor store, they have a lot of passionate customers. Those are the sorts of brands that will do well with branded content. But most brands, I don't think, will do that well. And I know a lot of them have tried to do branded content where they take two people and they put them in a room and they think that that's going to be a great podcast, and it rarely is a great podcast.
Okay, so before we conclude our recap of 2023 and what's mattered, I don't think you can talk about 2023 in business without mentioning AI. It is more obvious, I think, how it's already started to impact other industries. But how do you feel that AI has already impacted audio? What is the significance this year?
So you're going to get somewhat of a dumb answer here, because I think that, and I'm going to only use this word once in our entire thing, authenticity counts. And I don't think audio AI is going to be authentic. In other words, Joe Rogan is going to do the Joe Rogan show. He's not going to do the Joe Rogan AI show. It won't work. So we sort of have that protection. But there are lots of tools sitting around there that are quite useful for somebody creating a podcast, whether it be show notes, summaries, things of that nature. Go to it. Fantastic, wonderful tools, already using them here. But I do think the protection for most podcasters is star power, personalities. Those are the things that people are listening for.
Yeah, the hard thing is that there's no standards, and correct me if there's more regulation than I'm aware of, but you could have a show that takes a celebrity's likeness and repurposes it so that you're not necessarily clear on if it's them reading something that is scripted or an AI version that they didn't even read. And then it gets more complicated when they're doing recommendations for products and services that they didn't actually say themselves. This, to me, is the bigger threat, and I feel that it's more dangerous than it appears, because I agree with you. The business is going to pull toward authenticity. Consumers don't really care. If the machine can do it on your behalf, that may help you be more efficient in your production process, but it's not going to make for a better show. However, that's not the problem. That just means some people are going to launch some experiments that are going to be stupid and people aren't going to pay attention to it. But where it's dangerous is if we betray the listener and we don't disclose to them that these things aren't real. I see that as a major threat to the industry and the credibility of everybody else. And I don't want to see a few bad apples spoiling the bunch. Do you think that's what is the size of that threat in your view?
Yeah, you know what? In the short term, it's probably bigger than the long term. I think trust is a key factor with any audience, durable audience, and if you're going to mess with that, then you're messing with your franchise. If you are not in that echelon and you are trying to crack into the upper tier, I think it's a foolish way to go about it. This may be totally naive on my part. I think there will be some bad experiments, but I don't think that this is a threat to the podcast business.
All right. Final here. I think we have a duty to acknowledge the Deal Book interview with Elon Musk that happened last week, where he told advertisers who would pull off of his platform X, where he told them to go F themselves, but he actually said the word. So any reaction from you where you can draw a parallel to the dynamic? Because this dynamic, I think, exists on all platforms to some extent. What is it? What can we take out of this and apply to the audio field?
Yeah, and I think it's also important to know that David Zaslav from Warner showed up right after that, and so did Bob Iger from Disney right after that. They immediately went on in the issue of trust with the consumer, and in his case, Elon, how important is Twitter in the advertising ecosystem? They can buy around him, and they're going to buy around him. I think his threat, he feels, is that he can say, you need Twitter. And if you don't have Twitter, well, I think that there are other products sitting, waiting and ready should Twitter disappear. But I got to say, it's such an arrogant view of his import. And if I were Linda Yaccarino, I would be back looking for work, because this is never going to happen for her there.
Yeah, well, look, I'll give you my reaction, which is slightly different than yours. I will acknowledge that Musk has personally, I think his lack of emotional maturity that he's exhibited in dealing with these types of issues, and with the way he's used the platform as a user, I think that he has failed tremendously in what started as a premise that I really was supportive of. I really liked what he stated that he wanted to do with the platform, and then he completely undermined it in the way he used it himself. So I want to get that on the table. But where I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater with this is to say that I think it's a little bit good when there are creators or owners of platforms that don't get pushed around too much by the advertising community, so that they are undermining their core missions and taking away voices that they feel should have a platform in a free speech town square type of ecosystem. I think that's a defensible argument, and one that has value at its core. It just has such a lousy messenger in this case. But
Shocking.
there are
Shocking.
Yeah, shocking. But I have talked to some of the biggest creators in our field and gotten similar reactions where they say, I don't care what anybody thinks, I'm going to do my show my way, which is foolish in many ways. And yet I also appreciate that they are not going to they're going to stay the course on what they believe, and not cave on that based on money. So I think there's two sides of it that are very hard to disentangle, and it's so easy to make it black and white on this one. But brand safety and suitability, and the way that that's applied to pressure the manufacturers of content, there's another side to that story that I think he's representing poorly, but does need more fair representation, which incidentally, it's why we started the Media Roundtable, was to talk to people about why are we so divided, and what are we doing? Why are the incentive structures set up in such a way that it just rewards fighting and insulting people and being harmful? And how do we restructure that without taking away the ability for a platform to showcase alternative points of view? It's a hard problem that I believe we still have to contend with, even as we move into 2024, Twitter or no Twitter. So,
yeah, but it's less about the content, although I do think that's a huge factor, and it's more about the personality at this point.
totally.
And whether or not advertisers want to support something that they can't trust or believe in.
Yeah, totally. And you can do lots of parallels in politics today about
Exactly
whether or not you support the policy. Can you support a policy that's led by somebody that's really not demonstrating humility and the character attributes you'd want to see with somebody with such a large platform? So anyway, well, this has been an amazing discussion, and I am pleased to announce that that Steve has agreed to return for a second conversation where we look ahead at 2024 and talk about what should we expect this year and how do we deal with it. So the part 2 is forthcoming in January. And Steve, I just want to thank you for your insight, for your relentless championship of this industry that we both care so much about. I think you continue to be a force for good. And I'm glad to see you bridging the gap between the world we came out of and the next generation. Very few people can say that they're doing that, but you really are. So thanks for spending the time with us today.
As are you, and the business that you've built so wisely over this time. It's a pleasure.
Thank you for saying that. So this podcast is brought to you by Oxford Road, where we want you to succeed in audio and to use your influence for good. As members of the marketing community, we have the power to advance voices that don't just entertain, but also edify and build bridges instead of burning them, per our conversation earlier. We'd love to hear from you. And if you have feedback for how we can do our jobs better, please don't hesitate to reach out at info@mediaroundtable.com. And if you're a marketer looking to align with our vision, reach out to our agency, Oxford Road, by visiting oxfordroad.com and subscribing to our weekly newsletter, The Influencer. And while I'm on that, Steve, since you're still with me, how can people reach you?
Amplifi Media, AMPLIFI Media.com is the best way to reach me.
And special thanks to Bianca, Kyle, Haley, Scott, Mary Jane, Everett, the team at Podcast One, and everybody that's helped make this possible. And as always, influence responsibly.
Have you heard? McDonald's, the burger OG, took their classic burgers back to the kitchen and they've come out hotter, juicier, and tastier. Onions added at the grill, perfectly melted cheese. Plus, the burger icon, the Big Mac, now has more Mac sauce. Just how good are these burgers? Rubble, rubble. Yep, they're so good they got the Hamburglar's attention. Better get down there before he eats them all. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba. Available at most restaurants in this area.
Sometimes it takes a different approach to help you unlock your true potential. With Capella University's game-changing FlexPath learning format, you gain relevant skills you can apply to your career right away. Earn your degree from an accredited university and be confident in the quality of your education. Imagine your future differently at capella.edu. Capella University is accredited by the Higher Learning Commission. Learn more at capella.edu/accreditation.